October 1942. Station 105, Chelston Airfield, England. Inside the field hospital's surgical tent, Colonel Malcolm Cummings Grow worked over another injured navigator. The young man's chest had been perforated by fragments of German anti-aircraft fire, which had shredded his leather flight jacket almost as if it were tissue paper. Grow's experience in recent weeks allowed him to instantly recognize the pattern. The shrapnel moved at relatively low velocity, having lost much of its initial energy before striking its target. What haunted him was the absence of any protective layer between the man's body and the fragments that had torn through the bomber's fuselage. Beyond the canvas walls, the sound of another B-17 laboring over the airfield reached him. The bomber had returned from yet another daylight mission over Germany. Ambulances were arriving in steady procession, carrying men wounded in the skies. The statistics were beginning to weigh heavily on Grow. Nearly 70% of the casualties passing through his care exhibited the same type of injury, wounds caused not by enemy fighters but by debris from exploding anti-aircraft shells. These missiles moved slowly enough that their lethal potential might have been mitigated with some form of protection. Some fragments had detached from the bombers themselves, thrown violently inside the aircraft by the force of nearby flak bursts. This particular navigator would survive, but many others would not. Standing back from the operating table, Grow realized something significant: these injuries were avoidable. The protective technology necessary to reduce such fatalities already existed. It was a matter of asking the right question in the right setting. Within months, that insight would lead to interventions that saved thousands of lives. The unraveling of unarmored bomber crew safety began on August 17, 1942. On that day, the 97th Bomb Group conducted the first American heavy bomber mission of the war. 18 B-17 Flying Fortresses crossed the English Channel to strike the rail yards at Rouen-Sortel in occupied France. Major Paul Tibbets commanded a dozen bombers toward the main objective, while the remaining 6 executed a diversionary operation. All aircraft returned to England without losses, but the relatively light resistance near the French coast proved misleading. As the 8th Air Force penetrated deeper into territories controlled by Germany during the fall and winter of 1942, casualty reports painted a starkly different picture from earlier expectations. By October, a thorough analysis of aircrew injuries revealed a pattern that challenged conventional assumptions. Medical officers compiled comprehensive data from all wounded personnel treated in British hospitals. The findings were sobering. Nearly 70% of casualties resulted from fragments of flak and dislodged aircraft components rather than from enemy fighter attacks. The Germans had perfected their anti-aircraft defenses over years of combat experience. By the end of 1942, thousands of flak guns were strategically placed to defend key installations. The standard 88mm shell, equipped with a timed fuse, could reach altitudes above 30,000 feet, dispersing hundreds of high-velocity shards upon detonation, turning the surrounding sky into a lethal minefield. Colonel Grow immediately grasped the medical consequences. Data showed that injuries to the torso were the primary cause of death. Chest wounds alone accounted for 36% of fatalities among crews lacking armor, while abdominal injuries contributed another 39%. Together, these core body injuries represented 3/4 of all deaths among bomber personnel. The conclusion was clear: protecting the torso would dramatically reduce fatalities. However, the solution was not yet in place. In 1942, the United States Army Air Forces had no formal program to provide body armor for its airmen. During World War I, the idea of equipping soldiers with personal armor largely fell out of favor. Experiments with steel vests had shown that the weight severely limited mobility, a critical requirement for infantrymen maneuvering on the battlefield. However, the dynamics of aerial warfare introduced a distinct set of challenges. Crews aboard bombers were already burdened with heavy equipment, including oxygen systems, parachutes, and insulated flight suits. Operating in the constrained interior of a bomber, mobility was less crucial than simply surviving incoming attacks. The threats faced by aircrews were also different from those on the ground. Unlike infantry combat, where high-velocity bullets dominated, bomber crews were primarily endangered by slower-moving fragments. Dr. Groh, with his background in surgical medicine, possessed a detailed understanding of how projectiles caused wounds, a perspective largely absent among military planners. He recognized that a fragment from a flak shell, after traveling approximately 200 yards to strike the aircraft, had lost most of its initial speed. Such a piece, moving at roughly 500 to 1,000 feet per second, could be effectively stopped by a relatively thin layer of steel. The same logic applied to portions of aircraft structure ripped away by explosions. These were not armor-piercing rounds traveling at extreme velocities, but irregular, tumbling metal fragments that had expended much of their kinetic energy. In October 1942, Groh submitted a formal proposal to the headquarters of the 8th Air Force. He requested permission to design personal protective armor specifically for bomber crews. His submission included casualty analyses and preliminary diagrams of a vest composed of small, overlapping steel plates stitched into a flexible fabric. The concept drew inspiration from historical armor systems, particularly medieval brigandine, where overlapping plates provided protection while allowing reasonable freedom of movement. The initial reaction from Air Force officials was one of skepticism. They questioned whether crews could carry yet more weight on top of the roughly 40 pounds they already bore in parachutes, oxygen apparatus, and insulated flight clothing. Concerns extended beyond weight to cost, production feasibility, and whether airmen would accept and wear the armor in combat. Some argued that enhancing fighter escort strategies would provide better protection than outfitting crews with heavy vests. Despite these doubts, Groh advocated for a practical approach, a limited field trial. He proposed producing a small number of vests, distributing them to select crews, and monitoring casualty rates relative to unarmored crews. Headquarters granted approval for the experiment under one condition: the armor had to be designed and manufactured rapidly without relying on the standard military supply chain, which lacked the immediate capacity for production. Groh reached out to British contacts for assistance. The Royal Air Force had experimented with protective vests for their bomber crews but encountered significant difficulties. The interior of British bombers, especially the Avro Lancaster, the primary RAF heavy bomber, was extremely tight. Crews had little room to maneuver, making bulky armor impractical. By late 1942, the British had largely abandoned these efforts. American bombers, however, offered slightly more interior space. Aircraft such as the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator, though cramped compared to civilian aircraft, allowed more flexibility than their British counterparts. What had proven unworkable for the RAF might succeed with US crews. Through British connections, Groh was put in contact with the Wilkinson Sword Company, a manufacturer with a long and unusual history of armor production. Established in 1772, Wilkinson had initially specialized in swords and bayonets, later diversifying into razors while retaining expertise in metallurgy. During the Victorian era, the firm had produced bullet-resistant vests for British officers in colonial campaigns. By the First World War, Wilkinson had manufactured armor for officers, though its heavy weight made it unpopular in the field. During the Second World War, while the company primarily produced aircraft fire suppression systems, it retained the technical know-how to work with protective steel plate. This collaboration laid the foundation for the development of personal armor that was both light enough to wear in a confined bomber cockpit and capable of stopping low-velocity fragments, marking a unique adaptation of ancient protective principles to modern aerial warfare. In October 1942, Groh visited Wilkinson's facility, bringing with him initial design sketches and extensive medical research on combat injuries. The collaboration that ensued was atypical for the period, merging military medical knowledge with civilian manufacturing expertise. Groh contributed deep insights into wound mechanics and human anatomy, while Wilkinson offered specialized skills in metallurgy and industrial production. Together, they engaged in repeated design refinements, carefully negotiating the trade-offs between protection, weight, and mobility. The final armor configuration was composed of three distinct components. The main vest provided coverage for the torso, both front and back. A separate apron shielded the lower abdomen and groin, while an additional modular piece could be deployed to safeguard specific crew positions, such as ball turret gunners, who faced threats from unusual angles. Each component was built around 2-inch square manganese steel plates, roughly 1 mm thick. These plates were slightly overlapped and inserted into pockets within a durable canvas shell lined with soft cotton for comfort. The critical advancement lay in the choice of manganese steel, an alloy that combined high hardness with minimal thickness. This allowed the armor to halt or deflect low-velocity fragments without becoming prohibitively heavy. Individually, the plates were light, only a few ounces each, but collectively they protected the most vital areas of the torso. The combined vest and apron weighed approximately 22 pounds, a substantial load yet considered acceptable given the life-saving potential. To address emergency situations, the armor incorporated a quick-release system using color-coded cords and fasteners. A single pull on the red cord would remove the entire armor assembly, facilitating rapid egress from a damaged aircraft. By early 1943, Wilkinson had completed prototype suits, which were then tested in operational conditions starting in March. Crews initially received British-manufactured vests for field trials. Early reports were promising. Wounded airmen arrived at medical facilities wearing armor that had clearly absorbed or deflected flak fragments. Examination of these vests revealed that many fragments had been stopped within the steel plates, the residual energy insufficient to penetrate fully. By spring 1943, demand for the armor began to escalate. Word of its effectiveness spread across 8 Air Force bases in England. However, British production capabilities at Wilkinson Sword were unable to satisfy the growing need. With the company's facilities already committed to other wartime manufacturing priorities, output was limited to roughly 100 suits per month, far below what was required to equip the expanding 8th Air Force bomber units. In response, Colonel Grow initiated efforts to establish domestic production in the United States. The War Department quickly approved large-scale manufacturing of American-made armor, an effort notable for its cooperation between military arsenals and civilian artisans. Uniquely, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York was drawn into the project. Its armor workshop, staffed by experts in medieval armory and skilled craftspeople, became a key center for design research. The museum team analyzed historical armor, particularly brigandine designs from the 15th century, adapting their structural principles to modern materials and mass production techniques. The initiative was led by Stephen Grants, curator of the museum's Arms and Armor Department, who documented the methodology in a 1945 article for the Metropolitan Museum of Art Bulletin. The resulting design, known as the Mystics Armor Vest, drew directly from these historical influences. It represented the culmination of both centuries-old knowledge and contemporary engineering, forming the standardized protective suit issued to aircrew during the final years of the war. In the exhibition halls, curators and historians meticulously examined medieval suits of armor, seeking any features that could inspire new protective gear. No design was dismissed if it showed even a hint of adaptability. Specialists evaluated everything from the heavy, ornate armor used in jousting tournaments to more practical battlefield suits, mail shirts, interlocking scale armor, and the quilted jackets common during the Renaissance. This unusual partnership between scholars of medieval arms and contemporary military engineers became one of the most distinctive research collaborations of the war period. Craftsmen accustomed to restoring priceless historical artifacts now found themselves creating equipment intended to save the lives of bomber crews. Centuries of accumulated knowledge on armor construction suddenly had a direct, practical application in the context of aerial combat. By mid-1943, American factories had begun producing body armor in multiple variants based on these studies. The Munair vest, the standardized model, incorporated a nylon outer shell in place of canvas, greatly improving resistance to water and wear, while retaining a cotton interior for wearer comfort. Steel plates were manufactured to specifications developed in collaboration with Wilkinson Sword. Production quickly escalated as manufacturers nationwide received government contracts. On October 5, 1943, the Munair Flyers vest was formally declared standard issue for all personnel in the 8th Air Force's bomber crews. Orders mandated that each crew member receive armor tailored to their role within the aircraft, a task requiring extensive logistical coordination. The 8th Air Force itself was expanding rapidly during the fall of 1943, with new bomb groups arriving in England every month. Each group needed hundreds of armor sets. The Mun vest, weighing 17 pounds and 6 ounces, was lighter than its British Wilkinson counterpart thanks to optimized steel plate placement and improved fabric selection. Modifications allowed specific crew members to wear variants suited to their positions. Pilots and co-pilots seated in armored compartments received the M2 vest with reduced rear coverage. Ball turret gunners used the M3 apron designed for cramped spaces. Waist gunners wore the M4 apron, optimized for standing duties, and bombers, navigators. This modular approach enabled crews to adjust protection according to their exposure to threats. Initial reluctance to wear the armor vanished once crews experienced it in combat. By early 1944, the program had expanded further to include complementary protective equipment. Among these innovations was the M3 helmet, specifically developed for bomber crews. Constructed from overlapping manganese steel strips mounted on a leather flying helmet base, it offered superior shrapnel protection compared to standard infantry helmets. The GROW helmet, named after its designer, employed 5 overlapping steel strips capable of stopping fragments that could penetrate conventional helmet designs. A study conducted by 8th Air Force medical officers analyzed casualties from heavy bombardment missions, comparing crews with and without armor. Reviewing 1,117 incidents, the study found that unarmored crew members suffered fatal chest wounds in 36% of cases and abdominal deaths in 39%. For armored personnel, these rates dropped dramatically to 8% and 7%, representing reductions of 77.1% and 82.1% in thoracic and abdominal fatalities, respectively. Further analysis revealed a 58% decrease in overall injuries and a 60% reduction in total wounds sustained among bomber crews after armor was introduced. Despite its effectiveness, the armor had limitations. Head injuries remained deadly regardless of torso protection, and wounds to the limbs continued to cause casualties. Fragments striking at extreme angles sometimes penetrated the gaps, and direct hits from larger caliber projectiles could defeat the steel plates. Nevertheless, the armor achieved its primary goal. It stopped the majority of slower-moving fragments, which represented the greatest hazard to bomber crews. The impact of these protections was evident during missions such as the October 14, 1943 raid on the Schweinfurt ball bearing factories, later dubbed Black Thursday. Out of 291 B-17 bombers dispatched, 60 were lost. 17 medical officers inspecting returning crews noted the vest's effectiveness in preventing additional injuries. Fragments embedded in steel plates illustrated how lives had been saved. While the armor could not eliminate all casualties, it mitigated the most common and survivable threats faced by crews in daylight strategic bombing missions of 1943, highlighting the crucial role of historical armor design in modern aerial warfare. During the bleakest months of the Allied bombing campaign in World War II, aircrews faced staggering dangers despite the protective measures in place. Early in the campaign, bomber losses remained alarmingly high, and it became evident that armor alone could not sufficiently safeguard crews. The strategic turning point came with the deployment of long-range fighter escorts. P-51 Mustangs, capable of accompanying bombers on deep incursions into German territory, fundamentally shifted the tactical balance. These fighters engaged enemy interceptors before they could reach the vulnerable bomber formations, significantly reducing losses. When combined with reinforced crew armor, this dual approach produced a remarkable improvement in survival rates by the spring of 1944. By the time Operation Overlord began in June 1944, the 8th Air Force had matured into a highly capable and coordinated striking force. Thousands of aircraft executed meticulously planned raids targeting German supply lines, transportation hubs, and fortified positions in occupied France. The production and distribution of protective gear had reached a level that ensured nearly every bomber crew member was equipped. Initial shortages of body armor were overcome rapidly, and by the end of the war, the U.S. had manufactured 338,780 MUN vests and 95,919 MEM2 vests. One of the most striking aspects of this program was the speed with which it moved from concept to widespread implementation. Colonel Malcolm Grove's preliminary assessment in October 1942 triggered a full-scale production effort that reached completion by late 1943. This swift timeline encompassed design work, prototype testing, contractor selection, ramping up industrial output, and establishing a logistical network for delivery to the front lines. The Armour Initiative also highlighted effective transatlantic collaboration. British firms, including Wilkinson Sword, provided initial production capabilities, while British metallurgists offered expertise in steel alloys. Under reverse Lend-Lease arrangements, the UK supplied 9,600 flak jackets to American manufacturers, then expanded production, using the British designs as a foundation, and institutions like the Metropolitan Museum of Art contributed research that refined the design for US air requirements. This level of cross-organizational cooperation, spanning countries and civilian military lines, was unusual even during wartime. Colonel Grove's contributions extended well beyond protective vests. He developed enhanced oxygen systems to combat hypoxia at high altitudes, established rest homes for crews to recover from combat stress, and implemented psychiatric screening and support programs to reduce mental fatigue. His approach to aircrew welfare was holistic, addressing both the physical and psychological demands of combat operations. Recognition for Grove's innovations came swiftly. In July 1943, he was awarded the Legion of Merit for his pioneering work in developing body armor, which was shown to protect against the majority of wounds caused by relatively low-velocity projectiles, improving both survival and morale. By May 1944, he received the Distinguished Service Medal for introducing a series of protective and comfort-oriented measures for aircrews, including devices to shield gunners from windblast, electrically heated clothing, gloves, boots, hand warmers, casualty bags. These innovations reduced frostbite cases and increased operational efficiency. Following a comprehensive study of combat-related psychiatric breakdowns, Grove also introduced rest homes, a new pass system, and specialized medical training for tactical unit officers. After the war, he was appointed acting air surgeon for the U.S. Army Air Forces in 1945, becoming air surgeon in 1946, when the U.S. Surge Air Force separated as an independent branch in 1947. Its medical services initially remained part of the Army. On July 1, 1949, Malcolm Grove became the first Surgeon General of the U.S. Air Force, a position he held until November 30, 1949, retiring as a Major General the following day. He passed away on October 20, 1960, at the age of 72, witnessing the enduring impact of the body armor program he had initiated. The lessons learned from the World War II armor program directly influenced later conflicts. In the Korean War, the MON E-1952 vest adopted ballistic nylon rather than steel plates but retained the modular, flexible design principles first developed by Grove. During the Vietnam War, flak jackets incorporated stronger materials while continuing to follow the same conceptual framework. Modern body armor, utilizing Kevlar and ceramic plates, represents a technological evolution, yet its core purpose, shielding soldiers from projectiles and fragments, remains consistent with Grove's original vision. Today, every law enforcement officer wearing a bulletproof vest and every soldier equipped with body armor owes a debt to the innovations of World War II. While modern materials and manufacturing techniques are far more advanced than the canvas and steel-mown vests of the 1942s, the underlying strategy, flexible protection against lethal hazards, remains unchanged. The story of Malcolm Grove's work is not one of cinematic heroics on the battlefield. It is a testament to meticulous research, careful observation, inventive problem-solving, and persistent bureaucratic effort. His legacy continues to save lives around the world, demonstrating the lasting impact of practical, well-executed innovation in military medicine and personal protection. Colonel Malcolm Grove observed recurring patterns in the injuries he encountered among airmen. By carefully analyzing these patterns, he traced solutions that had historical precedents, adapting lessons from the past to urgent modern needs. He collaborated with partners who, at first glance, might have seemed unlikely allies, rigorously testing prototypes and refining approaches. Despite initial skepticism from peers, he pushed for implementation because the data clearly demonstrated both the effectiveness and the necessity of his ideas. The Flak Vest initiative became a striking example of how targeted technology can preserve life, even in highly lethal combat conditions, provided the right problems are identified and addressed with methodical precision. Survival in aerial warfare did not demand invincibility. It required protection that was sufficient to counter the threats most frequently encountered, thereby reducing casualties to levels deemed operationally acceptable. The Flyer's vest did not make airmen impervious to every danger, but it consistently prevented the majority of fragment wounds that proved fatal in earlier campaigns. The losses during the combined bomber offensives of World War II were staggering. By the conclusion of hostilities, the U.S. 8th and 15th Air Forces had sustained over 27,000 killed in action and roughly 9,000 wounded, while the Royal Air Force Bomber Command lost more than 55,000 personnel with an additional 18,000 injured. These numbers underscored the critical importance of any intervention that could improve survival chances. The introduction of body armor emerged as one of the most consequential life-saving innovations of the entire air war, documented to reduce overall casualties by 60% and decrease fatal torso injuries by over 77%. Airmen flying missions over heavily defended German territory in 1944 had markedly better survival odds compared to their counterparts in 1942, largely due to this innovation. Although advancements in fighter aircraft and tactical strategies contributed to increased survivability, the introduction of protective vests had a more direct impact because it specifically mitigated the most common cause of casualties, flak and shrapnel wounds. Thousands of airmen survive combat tours and return home thanks to the determination of one surgeon who believed that these injuries were largely preventable, dedicating himself to demonstrating and implementing practical solutions. The Malcolm Grow Medical Center at Andrews Air Force Base commemorates his legacy, ensuring that future generations of Air Force medical personnel recognize the physician whose work transformed aviation medicine. Grow's innovations extended beyond the flak vest, encompassing wind blast shields for gunners, electrically heated garments to prevent frostbite, enhanced oxygen delivery systems, structured psychological support, and rest facilities for airmen experiencing combat stress. Each of these advancements originated from careful study of medical data and a systematic approach to problem solving. In later decades, the Metropolitan Museum of Art highlighted the connection between medieval and modern protective gear. Exhibits displayed a 15th century brigandine side by side with a Monet Flyer's vest, illustrating how principles of layered plate armor had been reinterpreted with contemporary materials. Curators emphasized that the enduring challenge of safeguarding soldiers had been met with inventive applications of historical knowledge, bridging centuries of military engineering. The Wilkinson Sword Company, which had produced components for the flak vest during the war, returned to civilian production afterward, manufacturing razors and gardening tools. Yet, company histories retain pride in their contribution to life-saving wartime equipment, recounting in detail their collaboration with Colonel Grow and their role in the development of protective technology that preserved thousands of American lives. The development of the flak vest during World War II offers enduring lessons in innovation and problem-solving. Often, breakthrough solutions emerge from sources that are unexpected. In this case, it was a medical officer, rather than someone in procurement, who first recognized the vulnerability of bomber crews and proposed a protective solution. A manufacturer known for producing swords, not military armor, provided the initial production capacity, while expertise in design came from a fine arts institution, not a military research facility. The success of the program relied on integrating knowledge from diverse fields, demonstrating that innovation is rarely confined to conventional silos. Colonel Malcolm Grow grounded his initiative in rigorous medical evidence. Statistical analysis of combat injuries revealed the specific risks faced by bomber crews. Early prototypes were tested under controlled conditions, producing data that confirmed their protective value. Subsequent scaling to full production was supported by clear reductions in casualties among units that received the vests. At each step, decisions were guided by measurable outcomes rather than assumptions or tradition. This systematic, evidence-driven approach was critical in overcoming both skepticism within the military hierarchy and bureaucratic obstacles. Most importantly, it proved that protective technology could materially reduce fatalities, even in high-risk operational environments. At the time, prevailing military thinking accepted high casualties among bomber crews as unavoidable. Operations over Germany in 1942 were assumed to be inherently lethal. Colonel Groh challenged this assumption, arguing that enhanced protection could meaningfully lower the risk of death, even if it could not completely prevent it. His approach, rooted in medical insight and engineering solutions, demonstrated that careful analysis and practical design could produce life-saving results. The flak vest ultimately became one of the fastest and most effective military innovations of the war. From initial concept in late 1942 to widespread deployment by the end of 1943, the program moved at an extraordinary pace, encompassing equipment design, field testing, production agreements, manufacturing scale-up, and distribution logistics. The achievement rested on several interrelated factors: clearly documented need, a feasible and effective solution, collaboration between military and civilian contributors, and consistent backing from Air Force leadership, who recognized that safeguarding crews was essential to maintaining the bombing campaign's effectiveness. Colonel Groh's work illustrates how careful observation, applied creativity, and persistence can translate into systemic change. By tracking injury patterns, identifying preventable causes, designing and testing solutions, and advocating relentlessly for implementation, he established a model for protective innovation that remains relevant today. The fundamental principles behind body armor for aircrews have endured. The steps are clear: identify threats, create protective solutions, balance protective benefit against mobility and weight, test under realistic conditions, and adopt as standard equipment. The quantitative impact was significant. Mortality among crew members struck in the chest by fragments fell dramatically, from roughly 36% before armor to 8% afterward. This improvement not only saved lives but reshaped aircrew behavior and strategic planning. Confidence in survivability allowed crews to perform missions with greater resolve, and commanders could plan more ambitious operations, secure in the knowledge that losses would be reduced. This historical episode underscores several broader truths. Innovation can come from surprising places. Bureaucratic resistance can be addressed when evidence clearly demonstrates urgency. Cross-disciplinary collaboration often produces solutions far superior to those developed in isolation. And decisions rooted in data invariably outperform those based on assumption. Above all, it highlights the power of individual initiative. One determined officer, working with partners outside traditional military structures, was able to design and implement a solution that saved thousands of lives. Colonel Groh's flak vest program remains a benchmark in military medicine and protective technology. It demonstrates that careful observation, methodical design, creative problem-solving, and sustained advocacy can overcome even formidable challenges. The program's legacy persists not only in the equipment that continues to safeguard military and law enforcement personnel, but also as a reminder that committed individuals, armed with evidence and determination, can effect change with consequences that echo across generations.